Hello and welcome to the Life After Diets podcast. I'm Sarah Dosanjh, psychotherapist and author of the book, I Can't Stop Eating.
And I'm Stefanie Michele, binge recovery health coach. If you feel out of control around food, we get it because we've been there.
Thank you for joining our conversations about how to make peace with food and feel more comfortable in our bodies.
Now on to this week's episode.
Hello, Steph.
Hello, Sarah.
And hello to our community who are also joining us today. We are recording this episode live in our Facebook group. And if you want to be part of our community, you can find out how in the notes below. How was that?
That was good.
Good. What are we talking about today, Steph?
Everybody's favorite topic, depression and anxiety, and its intersection with food.
This is huge. Yeah. I mean, maybe may even end up in a part 2 or a part 3. Who knows? We'll see how we go today. But I feel like you are better equipped than I am to talk to these in a way, because you had both, or you struggled with both, and because it was depression in your 20s and then more into anxiety in your 30s. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So that means you should have all of the answers today.
Yes, I do. I've figured everything out based on my experiences. Depression actually started for me in my teen years, and it was with the onset of puberty, really. And the eating disorder it all sort of crashed in at once. I was around the age of 15. I remember having the feelings of depression coming in. I didn't know I didn't know what it was, and neither did anyone around me. So my family really took it as character. And that's how I really internalized what my depression was. It's still something that I feel like that was my first knowing of what depression was this character flaw. Like that's what it felt like. And only later did I understand it, and it was diagnosed as depression. And it came so alongside of food and body image issues that they were very conflated. And they intersect so much, but recently is where I've understood it to be that they're distinct, right? That they can operate independently, because I don't have binge eating behavior now, or any eating disorder behavior now, but I still deal with bouts of depression, which are now fewer and farther between, but more chronic anxiety, which is getting better, I have to say. I was just talking to my husband yesterday or 2 nights ago, and I turned to him and I said, Mike, I haven't called a specialist for like a health anxiety, for like a health condition in months. He thought about it and he was like, well, yeah. He was like, I had a mammogram last week, and he said, what were the results? I said, I don't know. They don't tell you on the spot anymore. They mail you a card. And he's like, looked at me just like, what? You haven't even mentioned it. So these these ways that anxiety has been showing up in my life, one of which was definitely health anxiety, used to be food as well, have been getting better and just sort of trending off a little bit. So it's been really interesting, even just in the past 6 months to a year, to watch that change.
I'm wondering, as we throwing these terms around, whether we need to do anything around defining for the listeners what it is that we're talking about, because there's a scale, right? Most people know what feeling anxious or feeling depressed is in a colloquial daily sense. And then you've got more clinical diagnosis. And they even use the word disorder now, don't they? Anxiety disorder, depression disorder. Mm-hmm. I suppose I want to acknowledge the scale, but also I imagine that as we're talking about it, we're kind of going to be quite broad in our definitions, would you say?
Yeah. Do you have definitions pulled up, or do you have the DSM in front of you?
I've got it memorized in my head. Why would I need to pull it up? No, I do not. Let's look at the colloquial ones first.
Okay.
Yeah. Don't worry, folks. We do this all the time in episodes. We just cut it out so the rest of you don't know.
You just don't hear the long pauses.
Yeah, exactly. I should get you to sing while I'm doing it or something like that.
Oh, yeah. That's how I manage my anxiety.
Yeah, you do that, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
What do you have a go-to to sing?
No, I sing what's in my head. Like,
oh yeah, you said it before, like you might sing, oh, walk into the kitchen. Get this up.
I gotta get the kids to bed, gotta do lunches, gotta get everything done so soon. Frustration. Yeah.
I enjoyed that. Thank you.
Can't believe it. It's like live enough that I can't take it back.
No, and I'm leaving that in. Don't you worry. I'm going to go to the NHS website because that is just the first one that's coming up on Google. The NHS overview of clinical depression is more than simply feeling unhappy or fed up for a few days. Most people go through periods of feeling down, but when you're depressed, you feel persistently sad for weeks or months rather than just a few days. Some people think depression is trivial and not a genuine health condition. They're wrong. It is a real illness with real symptoms. Depression is not a sign of weakness or something you can snap out of by pulling yourself together. The good news is, with the right treatment and support, most people with depression can make a full recovery. Is that true?
I don't know.
Oh, it's a very optimistic website here.
Yeah. To me also, it's not something you have and then you recover from. I think it's something that's inside that can be brought up to varying degrees. And that's kind of how I feel about depression, particularly now. For example, this past weekend, as I was telling you earlier before we signed on here, I don't know if it was the full moon or what, but I was slammed with, out of nowhere, no obvious trigger, not part of my cycle, just all of a sudden was like, I hit a wall of what I would call depression. And I'll use the word knowing that the true definition is this persistent, longer term condition. And I get that. And I lived in that for years where it never relented. This past weekend was this like, oh, it's here. It's here. There's a distinct feeling. It's not like, oh, I'm kind of bummed or I'm feeling low energy. It was more like there is a despair that I have nothing to do with, it feels like. That's how I really relate to it. It's just like, oh, this is happening to me. And it's such a familiar feeling that I classify it like as depression, and I'll call it that. And maybe that's inaccurate, but I call it that because it's like, this is what it used to feel like. This is what that is. It's not a bad mood. It's something else. And that will come in. And then it left by Monday afternoon. It was kind of gone.
There's two things in what you said there that I really relate to. One being the despair part. And I think I've mentioned that before. Like for me, it's a really deep, deep existential despair. And also for me, it always comes with this thought or this idea, I don't want to live. And that's not actively suicidal. It's just life feels too hard. Everything
Yeah.
feels unmanageable. Even though my rational brain can know that this feeling's not going to last forever, everything else in me is saying that it can and it will. And that's from a personal experience, how I would experience something like depression. And I've never been diagnosed with depression,
Mhm.
but I think there have definitely been considerable chunks of my life where, had I gone and sought a diagnosis, then I think that's what I would have been diagnosed with. And one of the reasons why I didn't was because I thought, in terms of solutions, what would it offer me? I know that medication and antidepressants saves lives. For some people, it's absolutely the right choice for them. I think for me, because depression is often linked with a lot of the hormonal issues that I deal with,
Mm.
my felt sense, my kind of personal perspective on my own experience was that this wasn't, again, like, I don't know if that was just the depression thing, but for me, it felt like it wasn't something that could be improved just by changing the brain chemistry. I always felt like there was something more to it, and that it was also linked with me, I guess, and how I
Yeah.
felt about myself.
I agree. And as someone who I've been on medication for depression many times and various not kinds actually, they were always SSRIs, but different ones. And it never resolved it. It just took an edge off. Right. So I never felt that it was getting the entirety of it. There was no benefit in my 20s that I could perceive, but in my 30s there was. And even last year when I moved into this house, I hit a wall of depression for about 3 months. And I went back on medication. It was also anxiety. It was both at the same. It was, oh gosh, that was a terrible winter last year. And I went on medication because it got that bad, and it did take an edge off. It helped, but it did not resolve. Right.
Mhm.
So it just got me sort of over the hump. So yeah, to me, it doesn't feel like it's one single cause. Maybe for some it is, but I think there's multiple elements going on that we're not fully aware of.
And so, what would your instinct be about what the research says about eating disorders and binge eating and depression in terms
Would
of like how they affect one another?
Well, you can see that it's it's chicken or egg, right? My personal take on it is that whatever this constellation of factors is that creates conditions for depression to exist or anxiety, I think that those same influences must have to do also with eating disorder behavior, but not entirely, because again, I can have one without the other now, right? So it's not absolute, but certainly that they're influenced by some collection of factors that seems to have a similar root. Because when we're feeling despair, there tends to be more of this black and white thinking, just more, there's less access to self-compassion. There's less access to energy in general to deal with the default of, "Ugh, I might as well just eat all the things. I'm not going to get better anyway. I need a lot of comfort right now." You know what I mean? Like all of these things, I think they feed each other. I think they end up feeding each other. And in my experience, when one has improved, the other has generally improved. And I'm not sure which begins, but to me, it feels like I would have said, if I didn't have an eating disorder, I won't be as depressed. And maybe that was true. But I also feel like when that depression would hit, it was a huge player in my eating disorder, like in the amount of influence I felt I had over my eating disorder behaviors.
So what you're saying is that they were bidirectionally correlated?
Yes, obviously.
This information is taken from Jake Lenardon, by the way, does a lot of research into binge eating and the like. And he looks at the research and says there's very clear evidence to suggest that depression can be a causal factor for binge eating, and that binge eating can cause depression. And then the whole cycle of those two kind of exacerbating one another. What percentage do you think of people who struggle with binge eating have also had a diagnosis of depression at some point in their life?
80%.
54.
Really?
Mm-hmm. But then I wouldn't fall into that 54 because I haven't had a diagnosis. So that's something as well. They can only measure in terms of people who've gone and sought help for depression.
Yeah.
But I think if you're struggling with your food and you're feeling depressed, it's certainly for me anyway, I easily fell into that trap of thinking I'm bringing this all on myself. The depression's not the problem. I need to fix the food. I can't fix the food. Oh, I'm still depressed.
It's awful.
Yeah.
It's just talking about it. And even over the weekend when I felt that level of despair again, it was like, oh, how little, what it ends up feeling like is how little influence I have over my life or over myself or over the way I feel. Like you really feel so overtaken and that you don't have agency over this. And I think that's part of what perpetuates that sense of depression. We just don't have like that. It's so overtaking, and even with behavior. So over this past weekend, I did use tools to help me sometimes. And it didn't make me feel better. It was just going through motions. And that is such a bad feeling. You know what I mean? When you're like, I'm doing the things and I feel like this anyway.
And a really tricky one when the advice often is, eat, quote unquote, right, exercise, sleep, do all these things that can feel impossible to do when you're depressed, right? And then now you can blame yourself for not doing the things that you hear are supposed to make you feel better. And the thing was, sometimes they would, and sometimes they wouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I would do them and they wouldn't. Sometimes I would do them and they would. And sometimes I just couldn't do them.
Yep. Yes. 100% that. What's an interesting take on depression, and I know we haven't even touched on anxiety yet. We will. In the way that I understand it now, as you know, I'm going to bring up the nervous system theory on this, and it makes sense to me. Let me know what you think. So the idea is that depression is actually a function of the nervous system after it's exceeded its state of fight or flight. So when we're in a thriving place, like we're able to connect, we're able to engage, we're sort of within our window of tolerance, where we can handle life stressors without getting too overwhelmed by them. This is this one state of the nervous system where we'd ideally like to be. And then there's stress that comes in and we sort of enter more of this fight or flight phase of like, Maybe this can show up as anxiety a little bit, but it's just more of like this elevated state of the system that it's on some kind of alert, and we're starting to get a little too bogged down in the stressors. So some things start to fall off. Maybe we're not connecting as much. We're not feeling as motivated because we're kind of tending to this sense of stress inside. And when that is sustained for too long, because we still have to, deal with life's demands, right? Like we're still in a very high productivity world, like a hustle culture. We don't get a lot of time to just like tend to the stress, and rest and relax and overcome. We kind of have to just keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. And all this is low level. And over time, that the body at some point is like, enough is enough. And it elevates the nervous system status to this freeze state. So this fight, flight, freeze idea is really separate. There's fight and flight, and then there's freeze and fawn. But freeze is actually, according to the nervous system polyvagal theory, like the next state. So we move into freeze as a protective way. And we see this through mammals who are being attacked by stressors in their environment, and they will fight, or run. And at some point when they realize that they're not getting away and they have no power over this external stress, they actually freeze. And they stay very still, and their breath gets really like slow and shallow. And it's basically a conservation state. And the idea is that as humans, when the body feels like we can't get away from this stress, we have to shut ourselves down because we're not doing that ourselves. And so we move into this inertia. We move into this, like, I can't get up off the couch. I know I should, but I can't seem to move. I have no energy to do that. And it's the body's way of self-preserving and going into this hibernation mode so that we actually have the space to recover from the stress, and we're not putting demands on ourselves, and we're not doing other things except restoring. What happens though is, because we have our brains are evolved to where they are, we're having shame about that. So instead of like an animal in the wild might be like, okay, cool, I'm gonna freeze now, like, and it doesn't have any opinions about it. And then it eventually in time moves out of that state, starts to breathe again, starts to move, shakes it off, leaves. We are like, oh, I am the worst. And maybe other people in our environment are saying like, why don't you help yourself? You're not, get up, move, get outside, like go connect with people. What's wrong with you? And it's keeping that stress alive. So we're not coming out of it. We're basically just stuck in this freeze state because we're not able to restore there. And this is the theory that I really have a footing in. It makes sense to me when I think about the way that my own personal experience of depression evolved. And it just makes a lot of sense to me.
Mhm. Well, Melissa, who's watching this, has used the word collapse, like it freeze into collapse. And that word always really resonated with me. But then what you said about shame, like you freeze, the collapse for me came off the back of the shame, exactly that, the judgment. And about 3 months ago, I had a really profound shame shifting experience where I experienced the most intense shame for me, like that I can remember in years and years and years. But I came out of it with some new realizations about myself. And since then, 3 months ago, I've not once had that thought of, I don't want to live. And I used to get that thought at least once a month, maybe a couple of times a month, because I would say over the last couple of years, I wouldn't necessarily label it as I was in a depression for 2 years, but I was having these regular moments of deep despair that have passed with the release of shame. And it's also making me think about what we spoke about last week, which for those of you joining us today haven't heard this episode yet, but when it goes out, you will have done. When I spoke about what happened with the wasp flying into the room during the meditation, I froze. That was the initial phobic response. And then when the shame came down, then I collapsed into shame. So it's like the first bit, the freeze, that's what our bodies are going to do when we're in fear. That's this automatic thing. We come in and judge that and turn it into a conflict. And that's where we can drop down. Now, I'm not suggesting, and I know you're not either, that there aren't other reasons for depression that can come along, other biological factors and all of this. But what you say around that kind of path into it, I relate to 100%.
Yeah. And part of why I would associate shame with collapse is because you are your own last line of defense, right? So if you are abandoning yourself through shame, you've got no one, like you don't even have an inner sense of having your own back, and you feel completely abandoned. And I think that as humans, this is going to create a collapse, because if we don't have our own allyship, let alone, we need others, but we need self. And if we've got nothing, then we're going to collapse. And I think that's self-preserving. And I think that's why we get numb in depression.
There's a question coming in from someone joining us today who says, I was going to ask what you both thought of the more biological framing of some forms of depression, where depression is potentially an adaptive state when we're depleted and is a way of our body getting us to hunker down and recuperate. I don't think this is true of all experiences of depression, but I think it can be helpful if it feels true. I think the issue can come when we start putting meaning and narrative onto our feeling of depression, which is very human. But maybe depression can sometimes be seen as simply our body trying to protect us.
Yes, that's what this theory is espousing, which I think is a much more helpful way of thinking about it, versus my body is against me and I'm against me. I'm such a self-sabotager, the shame around that, right? This explanation to me can really free us of having the self-blame and understanding it as a way that we are adapting.
If you want connection and support around any of the topics we talk about on the podcast, we would love for you to join our membership community.
Members have access to monthly online support groups, a private Facebook group, live episode recordings, and member-only Q&As.
If you would like to join us, please head to lifeafterdietspodcast.com/community.
Now let's get back to the episode.
Another comment in the chat: depression causes overeating. The body changes, becomes heavier, and that leads to further depression and anxiety. Social anxiety in particular creates the vicious cycle. When we think about what depression does to the appetite, there's one form of depression where people lose their appetite. They don't want to eat. Often I've heard it described as such a feeling of not being able to, or not having that motivation to take care of oneself. Or there's a lot of shameful thoughts about feeling like you don't deserve to eat. There's all of that. Did you ever lose your appetite in your depressive state?
No, never. Only in anxiety, and a certain part of my anxiety.
And I would say the same. And there's also a lot of talk around eating and serotonin production, why we might crave certain foods. And I had a little look at this earlier, and I thought it was quite interesting. It's not carbohydrates that increase the serotonin spike in the brain. It's insulin. So carbohydrates effectively do it, as in they give us this insulin spike. But there's something about that. And that, it resonated with me, because what it made me think about was that idea of after a meal, having something sweet and not getting that same type of lift as I might have done if I was having that food as a snack and just on its own, because protein can actually inhibit this because it reduces the insulin production.
Yes. Right. Like the way it affects blood sugar. So sugar on its own will spike that insulin, versus in combination with proteins and fats, it will mitigate that effect. Well, that's the serotonin angle. And then there's also the dopamine, right? So eating itself is a reward response. And carbohydrates will have more of a dopamine response, right? So, and sugars. And when, to Jason's point, in a stress state or in a depressive state, we need more comfort, right? We need, if that is the response, and we're overeating, and then we're feeling, well, now my body's growing and now I feel like I can't show up. And this, by the way, is not biological. This is a learned thing. So if we have shame about our bodies and the size of our bodies, that will then create more of that depression. But there is an argument to say that if gaining weight doesn't produce distress, or if we're able to stay out of a shame spiral, then it wouldn't necessarily follow that would then increase your depression. But in our culture, it would. So for all intents and purposes, it just does. But then, so then we're disconnecting more. Then we're not going out as much, or maybe not engaging as much. We're withdrawing a little bit more because we're feeling badly about ourselves. So now the hits of dopamine, or, our feel good access and our centers of joy are getting more limited. And so then we need to eat more to comfort ourselves because we're having less dopamine. So then we're gaining weight, and then we get So we're basically narrowing our pool of feel good. And it's a vicious cycle that's feeding on itself, no pun intended. But this is where I think we have more influence over time, where when we're working on body image and acceptance and understanding body diversity, we can have more self-compassion when we gain weight then. And maybe the shame can stay a little bit more out of it. And that won't then continue that cycle of depression that keeps feeding on itself, right? So I think that's where we have some We can infiltrate this. But a lot of what my mental health journey has been was taking some of that shame and not owning it anymore. And that then didn't self-perpetuate those mental health conditions.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I think the shame work is the way in, because just trying to change your behavior isn't always possible. Just trying to change the way you feel doesn't work. So the question I always bring it back to when I'm working with people is, what are you making it mean? Someone might say to me, I feel anxious about meeting someone on Saturday I haven't seen for a long period of time because I've gained weight. Okay, what are you making it mean? And when you really break that down, there's normally a really, really harsh shame story under that about what it means about them, which is usually the story they're telling themselves, as opposed to what the other person's necessarily going to think.
Yeah.
But we don't have to be finished with depression by any means, because why would we want that? But let's talk about anxiety.
Yeah. Just yeah, I'm all in for that. I can talk about that a long time.
So the NHS, the overview of generalized anxiety disorder in adults is: anxiety is a feeling of unease, such as worry or fear, that can be mild or severe. Everyone has feelings of anxiety at some point in their life. For example, you may feel worried and anxious about sitting an exam or having a medical test or job interview. During times like these, feeling anxious can be perfectly normal. But some people find it hard to control their worries. Their feelings of anxiety are more constant and can often affect their daily lives. Anxiety is the main symptom of several conditions, including panic disorder, phobias such as agoraphobia or claustrophobia, PTSD, and social anxiety disorder. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah.
My first question to you is, as somebody who has and does experience both, which is your favorite?
Anxiety. And I say that really, like, I've been in such anxiety crises that I have thought to myself, I'd rather be in depression. And then a part of me is like, no, you wouldn't. Like, but it can get really, really bad. When my anxiety gets so acute that which doesn't happen a ton, but it does. When it gets really bad, I don't know. I can't tell you which one it's worse, but I'd rather have the more lower level anxiety that I've got more like now than the despair, depression, because it's that step before the freeze. So it does keep me in motion. So anxiety is this hyper energy that, like, my brain is going really fast, my body's going really fast, like my fear is on. It's very triggerable. This is not pleasant. It's picking between the two is silly, but like, I mean, it was a good question, but like, what I mean is like I couldn't possibly, but it's movement, and there's something I can do about that. And so now I think that I know how to take that energy and turn it a little bit so that it's helping me to a degree. Because I can see it now, I'm understanding it a little better. So I can move it into productive energy rather than unproductive energy. Anxiety used to come in the form of my mind spiraling, self-criticism, and the what ifs and the fears, and like the brain would just take that energy and run with it. And you would look at me and never know, like, well, you might, you might be like, she's talking really fast, but I could function this way, but inside of my head, it is just, I had a friend once say, your head must be like it's like going to Disney World. It's fun, but it's exhausting. And I feel like that was a really apt description of what it feels like when it's just so busy. There's so much to see. There's so much to look at, so much to be paying attention to. And it's quite exhausting. To me, it's like I'm watching it now, like, that's just a nest. These thoughts are not real. They're real, but I don't need to take them seriously. They're not facts. They're just this energy that's spinning, looking for something to perseverate on. And if I can move some of that energy out through either relaxation or movement, then a lot of that will sort of settle. And then I have this breath, and then there's more of a slowness. I've been working on that as part of a nervous system regulation experience, and I have found that to be really helpful.
It's interesting. Obviously, I don't have a decent comparison. Like it said on the website, yes, I felt anxious before about something. Sometimes it's proportionate, sometimes it's not, depending on what the thing might be. But not always, I think in the past, I remember thinking I would rather be anxious because then I'd get stuff done. That said, like over the last few years, even though the depression at times has been really difficult to manage. For me, I would rather be slower because there's space in that. And I think I have there's something for me around space and time that if it felt really crowded in, because one of the things I can feel stressed about quite often is a sense of lack of time and lots of things crowding in. And I think, oh, I've got so much. And I'm like, just prioritize, put it in a list, and it's absolutely fine. You talk about your thoughts being really fast. You seem to, just my experience of you anyways, you seem to be able to catch them and articulate them. I've seen and worked with people crippled with anxiety who can't even catch their thoughts. Like it's almost a blur. And they're just this feeling like walking around almost in a sense of like terror all the time.
Yes. Catching them because I'm speaking out loud on a podcast, right? But when you're walking around your home and it's going on in there, then it's spinning in there and it's very blurry. It's really vague and you can't catch it. You're thinking so fast you don't know what your own thoughts are. And what you say about the fear, that's essentially what it's like. Everything is interpreted through a lens of fear. And when I said earlier that I'd rather be in depression, that when I get so anxious that's a time where I'll think I'd rather be depressed. It's because when you're so like that, all that you want is slow. It's like, please slow it down. Please make it quiet. And that's why depression almost sounds like enviable, because it's really like the antithesis of that. And if you don't have the space, if you have to continually show up, if you don't have access to calm and space and quiet, this is torturous. And so food, to bring it around, well, gosh, it is maybe the only thing that feels good. It is the only thing that feels real sometimes. It's like you can hold it, you can taste it, all of your senses get involved, which is, by the way, like one of the nervous system regulators is using our senses. So food does that. Food is like, and it's also rewarding. And it's like, it's the slow, it's like, and I think sometimes with anxiety, you eat it really fast and it's mimicking your brain, but it's kind of slowing things down. It's just narrowing everything. The thoughts can just shut up and you just taste and eat and chew. And that gives you some sense of relief in that. And I think that's why, again, like it makes so much sense why you go to it, why we use it. Sometimes it feels like the only thing to do.
Mm. Yeah.
A depressing episode.
I think what you've articulated will really resonate with people. I think very much so. When I tried to find some statistics on anxiety and binge eating or eating disorders, I couldn't find anything specifically on binge eating. But what percentage or what fraction? We'll go with percentage, it's fine. I can work it out. What percentage?
Pause, cut out.
What percentage of people with an eating disorder have also been diagnosed with anxiety at some point?
50.
Two-thirds, so like 66%. So it's a bit higher than the
depression.
That's
interesting.
And again, I
wouldn't have thought so. I would have thought it was the opposite.
Really? And they kind of, when they were disseminating this research, again, which one comes first? Is it because people feeling anxious because they're struggling with food, or do they struggle with food because they feel anxious? But 42% of these started struggling with anxiety in childhood before their eating disorder symptoms. There seems to be stronger evidence to suggest that the anxiety comes first, that's not so obvious to be able to discern with the depression.
Yeah. Okay.
Which makes sense to me, right? Everything feels fast and out of control.
Yeah.
And the way that food with something like depression, it can stimulate us.
Mm-hmm.
And then with anxiety, it can
calm down.
Destimulate us? Is that a word?
Yeah. Destimulate. Yeah. It's yes. And that's what when I picture it, like if you're up here, food can bring you down here. And if you're down here, it can act in both directions. And it is comforting, right? I think we really underestimate, because we villainize emotional eating and comfort eating, right? This is bad. It is undesirable. The goal of healing your relationship with food is to not comfort eat. I mean, this is the messaging that we have. But food is comforting. It always has been. From the moment we're born, it's meant to be. It's associated with connection and our family and traditions and things that make us feel at home and make us feel safe. I mean, in theory. And that's part of food. And so I think to deny effect, it's doing us a disservice because it's not allowing us to understand why we need it, why we need it so much. And I'm sitting here talking about it and thinking about, gosh, like, what do you do when food is this savior in a state of depression or anxiety? How do we move away? And I think that when we're so in it, it's almost impossible. I've been in positions where my depression or anxiety have been so acute that, like, even knowing this stuff, it's like, it doesn't matter. I just need, I think it's not about the food first. It's about the space first. It's about understanding this and being able to slow something down just a little bit, just the tiniest bit, to be able to inject some kind of, I'm watching this happen rather than I'm in it. That's the room where all of a sudden, and shame's going to be part of that, right? The way we're talking to ourselves is part of that. I think the way we're understanding this is part of that. That when we get that little space, that's the place of influence where we can have some kind of change happen here. But I think when this is happening so fast and we're not understanding it, and then we're shaming on top of it, that window of tolerance is so tiny, it's non-existent, and we can't intervene. We can't get there. And if restriction is at play, the window of tolerance is even smaller because your body's literally in a state of stress physically, right? So like it's perceived as like there's scarcity out there, and then you've got that stress state going on, as well as any psychological or emotional stress state.
I think a helpful question for people to ask themselves if they are struggling with either or both is, does it wax and wane? Whether it's anxiety, whether it's depression, whether it's both, does it go up and down? Are there days when you're less in it and days when you're more in it? There's a chronic state with both of these where there are no days when you're out of it. There's no reprieve at all. And in those places, those are the places where it's going to be really, really hard to be able to do something to change. Like it's got you. And that, I think, is when you would need some kind of intervention. When it waxes and wanes, you have those moments where perhaps you have more space, where you have a bit more clarity. And having a think about what are the things that are possible depending on where you are. There was was it a post that you did where you were showing like how your best can change depending on the day?
I reposted it. Yeah.
Yeah, so like a chart going up and down. I think there's something about learning our cycles. The last couple of years, as I mentioned, I was struggling with these really kind of deep moments of despair. But I would probably say in the last 6 months of that or so, I was very much anticipating them so that when they came, I was naming them. And I would keep saying to myself, I am experiencing despair. And I didn't make it go away, but what it did in the moment, it kept reminding myself, even if it was hard to fully believe in the moment, that this is transient, that this is an experience. So because it waxed and waned, for me, accepting it helped it to move away and lift quicker. That's not going to work if you're in a chronic state of it. If you're in a chronic state of it, you really need some kind of help, some kind of intervention. And that, I think, is an important distinction as we're using these very broad terms in terms of people's experiences and what feels possible for them when they're trying to support themselves through this.
Yeah. I want to use the experience of the weekend to illustrate that and spin it a little bit, because so as I mentioned, over the weekend was this crash of some sort. And on Saturday and Sunday both, I went through some motions of using, but I don't know. There were some things I couldn't get to it. And then on Sunday night, there was this threshold of something that was offering me a little bit more space, just a little. It's not like I felt better. It's just that there was something. All of a sudden, my eyes opened a little wide, just a little wider. And the same tools that I'd been suggesting to myself or thinking I should do over the weekend, that I was like, no, no, no. All of a sudden, I felt something like, I could maybe do that right now. I could maybe get there at this moment. What actually happened was that I had a friend who we were going to go out to dinner, and it was like this, do I go out or do I not? And she gave me an out. She was like, I'm busy too. It's fine. And in that moment, I was like, I can be like, okay, fine, we'll cancel the plans and I'll stay in. And I knew what I would do. I knew that I would just like be grouchy and ruminate. But I, in that moment, was like, no, let's go. And I meant it. Like, it was just this, finally I had this access to it. And I was thinking, if this was 20 years ago, 15 years ago, I would have basically been so what the hell, because of the prior 2 days, it would have been like, I want to make it black and white. It's just kind of like this whole weekend has been the worst. I'm just going to hibernate for the rest of it. And very much like if I'd been binging the whole time, and it was like, I might as well just keep binging. It's this sense of, I feel so badly about what's been done, what I've just been through, or what's happening to me, that even when that threshold came up for me to have some influence, I wouldn't have taken it. I would have just been like, ugh, no. And in this moment, I was like, no, use it. And I did. And we ended up going out to dinner, and it was really nice. And we laughed and I laughed. And, when I came home, it wasn't like I was like, I feel so much better. It was like, I'm still grouchy, but there was some connection I'd made to myself at that point that was kind of like, all right, like it was just slightly different. Still in a bad mood, but. And it ended up waning over, by the next day it was fine. And I think that would have happened anyway. I have this feeling, but there was something about our agency in a threshold moment that you're talking about here, where that can show up, and when we're not so drawn in. If I'd been struggling with this for more than a weekend, I might not have had that same level of access, but I did in this moment. It was kind of like, I can understand why we get blinded by that and why we can't use these moments, because we're just so overcome by the shame of it all. Reminds me too of like exercise, where I would have been like, whatever, I've just eaten so much. Why would I go for a walk now? Even though going for a walk might help me, because I would have been thinking of it in terms of calories burned. It's just like, well, now I've eaten so many. What's the difference? But now it's like, well, no, getting out for a walk just helps my mental state.
Yeah, it's those little things that create momentum. And sometimes the first thing we do doesn't quite give us the big reward, but we did it. And there's something about recognizing, oh, I could do that now and I couldn't before. And that, like it's a shift in energy, right? Sometimes it doesn't even feel worth it, like you say, at the time. If it was just that, and then you went straight back to feeling how you were feeling for the next few weeks, what was the point?
Right.
But
there is.
Yeah. Sorry?
Yeah, there is a point. Those moments collect over time. And I think they give us our sense of influence on our own state. And that is what the opposite of despair is to me, right? Like having some influence on ourselves.
Yes, very much so. So are you going to sing us out today, Steph? Sing us an ending. Sing how the podcast is ending and how happy you are.
I want you to do it, Sarah.
I'm gonna
try it out.
See, I'm gonna pick it up and throw it back at you.
All right, yeah, no, it is time. It's time. We're at time.
We are at time. So if you guys could just go and tell people what we talked about today, that would be great. Okay, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
We'll see you next time. Gotta get the kids to bed, gotta do lunches, gotta get everything done so soon.